Good day. I'd like to welcome today's webinar on steps to higher soybean yields. My name is Eddie McGriff, and I'm Regional Extension Agent in North Alabama. The first thing we need to look at when we're talking about higher soybean yields is understanding the growth and development of the soybean plant. The best publication I've seen on how to do this is the Iowa State University publication on soybean growth and development. You can buy a copy of it online. I've got the web page and also the phone number if you decide you want to call them instead of going online to purchase it. The next thing we need to understand is the soybean growth and development stages, because I'm going to be mentioning these throughout the presentation. R1 is beginning bloom, R2 is full bloom, R3 is beginning pod, R4 is full pod, R5 beginning seed, R6 full seed, R7 beginning maturity, and R8 is full maturity. The next thing we need to understand is the differences between indeterminate and determinate varieties. In North Alabama, we're going to be planting mostly indeterminate varieties. Indeterminate variety continues its vegetative growth after flowering begins. Very different from a determinate variety, since once flowering begins with a determinate variety, you're going to cease vegetative growth. This gives the indeterminate variety a much greater advantage for higher yield potential, because it has new leaves that are continued to be produced after flowering. This is a fresh food factory going at high capacity versus a determinate variety if you plant these, where the leaves are older and decreasing in their ability to produce carbohydrates to the plant. Another thing we have to look at is indeterminate varieties are not as photosensitive as a determinate variety. This allows them to be planted early. If you were to plant a determinate variety early, what would happen is it would be very short when it begins to flower, and this takes away from the yield advantage. Now, most of the time when you get to a mid-group 5, that's the switch over from a determinate or an indeterminate to a determinate variety. Now, in North Alabama, we've seen growers in the Mississippi Delta, Arkansas, Mississippi, that have used the indeterminate varieties and planted them earlier. And what they've seen in a similar latitude to ours is a 15 to 25% yield increase by shifting from a traditional system to an early soybean production system. So the keys to this early production system, of course, is planting date. You want to plant as early as possible. In North Alabama, that's going to be somewhere between April the 15th and the 20th. And a lot of this is going to be determined by your soil temperatures. You want that soil temperature at planting depth to be 65 degrees or higher for 3 consecutive days and a warming trend forecast. If you do this, you're going to plant in mid to late April. You're going to have pod fill when we get our longest days of the year, and that is June 21st. Now, some growers tell me, well, I don't think I can get as favorable a weather pattern, so I'm going to like to plant later in mid to late May to June. But when you look at our average rainfall in North Alabama, 2000 to 2016, and I took these from the weather stations here in North Alabama, you see that there's not much difference in rainfall from June, July, and August. So you're going to have just as much chance of getting a favorable weather pattern planting in mid-April as you are mid-May. That doesn't mean that some years that the weather pattern may not favor the later planting. I'm just saying that you're going to have equal chance. So if you have an equal chance, you're going to have higher yield potential. So the advantages of planting early are a much higher yield potential. You're going to get more favorable conditions for a stand. In other words, when you plant in April or mid-April, late April, the chances that you're going to have favorable moisture is going to be more than if you were going to plant in late May. You'll have less warm pressure. Of course, the disadvantages are going to be cooler soils, danger of a late frost. In some years, we talked about this earlier, the weather pattern may favor a later planting. If you look at the data, we don't have any from Alabama, so we're going to take data from a similar latitude. If you look at your yield potential, when you look at the middle of April, you're going to continually have less yield potential as you get into May and into June. So definitely the yield potential favors the earlier planting. Now, when we look at a late Group 4, if we were to plant it April 15th, and that's at a 33-degree north latitude, this is about where Birmingham and Atlanta sits, you can see that when we plant in the middle of April, we're getting our past full bloom into early pod set, and you can see that this tends to go more to when our longest days of the year are. This means that there's more sunlight. More sunlight means a higher rate of photosynthesis, which is putting in more energy into the plant that goes into pod production. You can see when we plant in mid-May, what happens is we're only into vegetative growth when we get the longest day of the year. And definitely when we plant in the middle of June, what you see is we just begin to have vegetative growth. If you look at the soybeans light requirement, you can see that you want to have at 33 degrees north, and this is about where I'm pointing right now, you can see that you want to be in flowering and early pod production when you get the longest days of the year, June 21st. And also, I would note that the farther north you have, or the farther north you go, the longer your days are. So when you're looking at, the Midwest, they have longer days than we do just because of the tilt of the earth. And this gives them advantages as far as sunlight and photosynthesis capability compared to us in the Southeast. Now I'm going to get to some basics, and that's the optimum plant depth. I like to see it between 1 inch and 1.25 inches. I know that some people, when they plant later, a lot of times are chasing moisture, and they'll plant, deeper than 1.5 inches, 2 inches deep. A lot of times they won't get the stand. Soybean doesn't have the pushing power to plant much deeper than 1.5 inches and gets satisfactory stands. Seeding rate, I like it to be around 140,000 seed per acre, and this to me is your optimum. You can go as low as 120 to 125,000 seed per acre if you're planting a variety that is a bushing type rather than one that mainly sets on the main stem. Another important thing is row width. When you look at the research in the Southeast, it shows a 7% yield increase for every 10 inches of row reduction. That means if you go from a 30-inch row to a 20-inch row, you're generally going to see about a 7% yield increase. I can also would like to mention this assumes that there's no hard pan, and when you get to twin row, 20-inch and 15-inch row, you're probably going to lead to higher yields if you have no hard pan. I think when you go down to 15 inches from what we've seen in research, that's about when your yield increases stop. So if you're comparing a 15-inch row to a 7.5-inch row, then I don't think you're going to see much yield differences between them. So you can drill your beans, but I think once you reach a 15-inch row, that's where you stop seeing your yield increases. Another key to high yields is inoculation. Now, this is important where the soybeans haven't been planted in the last 3 to 5 years. And if you look at a lot of the literature out there, they say if you haven't planted or or if you planted soybeans in the last 3 to 5 years in that particular field, then you don't need to inoculate. I think for high yields, you need to inoculate every year. It's a cheap insurance. When you look at some of the data from Mississippi State, you can see the higher your inoculation, the higher your yield potential. So I would inoculate every year. It's something that doesn't cost very much money, and generally it's going to pay dividends. And one question I get is how much nitrogen can a legume like soybeans produce to produce X number of bushels? Well, a soybean plant can only produce enough nitrogen for somewhere around 60 to 70 bushels. So that means that the soybean plant is either going to not going to yield as high, or it's going to have to get its nitrogen from the soil to produce higher than 60 to 70 bushel yields if it's been well inoculated. But, you know, putting it out too much nitrogen can lead to some problems. Too much nitrogen can encourage lodging. So there's two things that encourage lodging. One is too much nitrogen too early, and another thing is too high a plant population. This picture right here is a 95Y70. You can see that it lodged early. It's not a variety that is really made for planting early. It was planted early in some trials, and you can see that once the plant lodges, it quits fruiting production and wants to grow vegetatively. So in our dry land conditions in North Alabama, the first thing I look at is, do we need additional nitrogen? One thing I look at is most of our soils up here have 2 to 3% organic matter. You've got to remember that organic matter is negatively charged. So when it deteriorates, what is it going to release? It's going to release negative ions, nitrogen, sulfur, a little boron. Generally, for each percent organic matter that you have in your soil, it's going to give you about 20 pounds of nitrogen. So when you're looking at 2 or 3% organic matter in North Alabama, that's 40 to 60 pounds of free nitrogen you're getting per year. What I always encourage growers is when you're having a soil sample, if you'll check, it's a little bit extra, but just check on 1 or 2 organic matter and just see what your organic matter is on your fields. Another thing I see is we have high use of chicken litter in North Alabama, and this chicken litter as it breaks down is going to give us some nitrogen also. One thing I'll point out is the soybean plant will use nitrogen that's available first before it starts nodulating. So you can actually decrease nitrogen or production of the soybean plant by providing too much nitrogen to it. So I would encourage growers that they probably, if you're dry land, you're probably not going to need any additional nitrogen. If you're looking at 80 to 100 plus bushels, then that's when I would consider maybe just putting 30 pounds of nitrogen out at planting. If you look at the nutrient requirements for 80 bushel soybeans, the most important thing is soybeans are a high user of potash. Now, I've taken a lot of nutrient or tissue samples on soybeans over the year with high yield growers that are making 80 plus bushels. Some, in some cases, are making more than 100 bushels. The only nutrient that I consistently find come up short in the tissue samples is potash. So I would say that potash is a key to high soybean yields. Once you start putting those pods on, just like the cotton boll is a potash sink, the soybean pod is a potash sink, and it will pull potash out of the leaves. If you look at some extremely high yielding soybeans, when you get to early pod production, look at this, you're taking 10 pounds. It takes 10 pounds of potash per day. That's a lot of potash. So this is a what the symptoms of potash deficiency look like in the leaf. As you can see that you get the yellowing around the margins of the leaves, and as it becomes more severe, you get necrosis, in other words, the deadening of the plant tissue. Now, here's some keys to higher soybean yields, and one is I would tissue sample every week. I would also, you need to scout your fields weekly. The other thing is consider applying a fungicide at R2, R3. A fungicide is insurance. It's protection against the fungal organisms, and you really want to have a fungicide out before disease begins to protect your plant. The one thing is, if you're scouting your field and you start seeing a disease, a lot of times it's too late for that fungicide to work properly if you already had the disease in the field. I would consider applying Dimilin, which is a insect growth regulator, at 2 ounces per acre. What I've seen is the Dimilin has helped suppress soybean loopers. That's one of our biggest problems. This may help us to alleviate a soybean looper application later on in the year. The other thing is, even though it just suppressed soybean loopers, two of the other insects that I've seen, the green clover worm and the bean leaf beetle, it is excellent at controlling those. And we don't really have velvet bean caterpillars in North Alabama, or I haven't seen them yet at much pressure, but the velvet bean caterpillars is actually excellent material on those too. Boron is important nutrient for pollination. I would consider putting 1/4 pound per acre with my Dimilin and my fungicide. And this is 1/4 pound of boron per acre is a quart of the 10% liquid, or 1.25 pounds of the 20% powder. Another thing is you want to be scouting very diligently during this time, because if you do have stink bugs or kudzu above threshold, it's very easy to put a pyrethroid in with this fungicide application. But I would be definitely scouting every week for these insects. Now, I want to talk a little bit about fungicides. We have several different modes of actions. One is we have the triazoles. That's something like propiconazole, which is your generic tilt. You have Folacure, Domar. These give you about 2 weeks of activity and some curative activity if you already have a disease starting the field. Now, your strobilins give you longer activity, about 3 weeks, but they have no curative activity. Most of the time, I see a farmer want to put out 2 modes of action, and I would encourage that. And that is a triazole and a strobilin. And this would be products like Quadris Extra, Quadris Excel, Stratego Yield. And then we have a product like Preaxer, which performs similar to the triazole and the strobilin, but it has a different mode of action with the strobilin, and that is a HDH inhibitor. Now, most of our growers don't have irrigation, but for those that do, it's critical to meet the demands of evapotranspiration. And that's during bloom about 1.5 inches per week. Once you get into pod elongation in pod fill, you're talking about 2 to 2.25 to 2.5 inches per week. When you look at our water use chart, of course, you know when you start to get the flowering in pod elongation, pod fill, that is your highest demand for water. So my final thoughts for high yield soybeans is to look at the variety trials, consider your own experiences with the variety, and pick a high yielding variety. When I'm planting early, the minimum I want to have is that seed treated with a fungicide. Now, if you plant early and you've got the ability to put a in-furrow fungicide, I would consider doing that. I know that in Arkansas and Mississippi Delta, they think that is one of their keys to higher yield. Remember, there's only two fungicides labeled for in-furrow application, and that's Preaxer and Abound. Another product that I would look at, and this is for high yield potential, is Poncho Olivo. Now, what Poncho Olivo is, the Poncho is a fungicide and an insecticide, and this insecticide helps us with early season pests. And one of the worst one I've seen is three-corner alfalfa hopper, and this will give us about 30 days protection against the three-corner alfalfa hopper. The Olivo portion will help us suppress nematodes. Now, our indeterminate varieties, most of them have cyst resistant, but they do not have reniform or root knot nematode resistance. The other thing I would look at that I like about the Olivo, if you have a very high yield potential on some of these fields, when I was out scouting them, these are growers making 80 plus bushels per acre. The stress on these plants were so high, when you got towards the end of the season, I was seeing southern death syndrome in these high yield fields. And this is what southern death syndrome actually looks like right here. So if you see your plants start to go down before maturity and they have these symptoms, I would look at either southern death syndrome or something that actually looks similar to this, would be root knot nematode injury. So towards the end of the season, when you have good moisture in late July or August, you might want to take a nematode sample just to see where you're standing on nematode pressure. So we talked about it. I plant as early as feasible. You need to build and maintain your soil fertility level. I would grid sample and apply a variable rate nutrients in lime. The supplemental nitrogen, I would only apply 30 pounds at planting if I had an 80 bushel or more yield potential. Consider applying a fungicide with the other products, the Dimilent and the boron at R2 and R3. Tissue sample and apply micronutrients as are needed. Eliminate hard pans. Beware of the nematode possibilities, and that means looking at taking a nematode sample when we get into July and August. Practice good crop rotation. That is key to minimizing disease and insect pressure. Plant a cover crop. A lot of people tell me that they like to use their winter weeds as a cover crop. And I always say that can be considered a cover crop, but that's like taking your sister to the prom. You have a date, but is that what you really want? So I would look at a good cover crop program, especially when we're looking at no-till or minimum till peanuts or soybeans. Sometimes I have to beat South Georgia out of as an agent in South Georgia, but we're talking about soybeans. Good irrigation program if possible. You need to scout weekly for all pests. The best thing you can put in your field is your shadow. And the other thing, or the last thing I would mention, is you need to have timely harvest. And this may include using a desiccant such as Permoxan. The other one, if you have morning glories, would be AIM. We have some other ones, sodium chlorate and Sharpen can also be used as desiccants. So I want to thank you for being with me today, and hopefully this presentation will help you make higher soybean yields in 2017.